This week's reading comes from Mark, chapter 10, verses 35 to 45. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want for me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Appoint us to sit at your one right hand and one at your left in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking, but you are able to drink the cup that I drink or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or to my left is not mine to appoint, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. Instead, whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be the first among you must be slave to all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many."
Welcome back to Good Samaritan United Methodist Community Online. We're delighted to have you in this time of worship. Whether you're joining us from your own living room, for the local cable station, we're so glad you're here on this day. As we continue through the beautiful days of October, we find ourselves again with this gospel reading with our friends the disciples once again arguing about who is the greatest. How unusual. This was pretty common occurrence for the disciples, as we know. You know, it's almost like I had this picture of them with Jesus in the lunchroom cafeteria, and they both want to get closest to him as possible. I mean, it's got a little bit of that vibe as we hear this text. What is it about our human tendency, something in just our human condition, that we all have these tendencies to want to jockey for position? What is it about our human nature where we want to jockey for position? If it means elbowing someone out of the way, if it means whatever it might mean in all its different possibilities. In the words of the Icelandic pop singer Björk, we're going to take a little trip back to the 90s here for a moment. In her song, Human Behavior, when she writes, "If you ever get close to a human and human behavior, be ready to get confused. And me and my hereafter, there's definitely no logic to human behavior, but yet so irresistible. And there is no map uncertain, and me and my fear cannot." The great mysteries of human behavior that we hear in our sacred text and as we live in our daily lives. For we humans are complicated beings. In today's gospel lesson, Jesus was showing James and John and all the disciples that there was a different calling once again for what true greatness entails. Here again, the gospel lesson, friends. "But it is not so among you. Instead, whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all." Now here's a couple of interpretation dynamics to consider. When you hear the word servant, what stirs in you? Do you have pictures of Downton Abbey and all the different servants waiting upon the aristocracy? What does the word servant stir in you? I remember early on in my ministry, as I was going through the ordination process, writing a paper about leadership and about some of the servant language that we have in our sacred tradition about what it means to be a spiritual leader in community, not just for pastors, but for all leaders. And about Jesus being a servant, which we hear in this text, and that modelship for leadership. And I think there's a lot of beauty to that. And I remember one of my mentors saying to me as we were reflecting on this in a meeting, she happens to be Mexican American. And she had said to me, Max, as I hear this, this is a word that doesn't really work for me with how my people have been treated for a long, long time. And I, as a white person, need to listen to that. And I can still remember this conversation very well today, obviously. I respect that. And we need to take these words with all their different possibilities and layers of meaning as we listen closely to the text and to people's lived experience. I also can hear our New Testament professor, Dave Fredrickson from Luther Seminary, who came over to teach at United, when he taught us about the Christ hymn in Philippians, and he reminded all of us students there was no such thing as servants in antiquity. Those are translations of the text in the New Revised or in other translations of the Bible, because the original word should all be slave. There was no such thing as a servant in antiquity. So again, we have these layers of language, and when we hear that word slave, there's a whole nother, I think, even deeper level, or at least parallel level of harm that's been associated with this word for millennia, about people being property owned less than and objects and not subjects in their own lives. For the history of slavery in our world is grisly, to say the least, and in our nation and in our state as well. This is part of our shared tradition too. And we bring all of that to the interpretation of this text and community. So given all of that and so much more, using the resources of our Wesleyan tradition and our quadrilateral, how do we apply these words as we live them in our daily lives? What does it mean to be a servant leader? And how do we handle those words of servant and slave with care for all? Here's this important text about leadership that we hear today, and an example that Jesus is sharing with his disciples about what this looks like. Looking at the tradition of the church, again, how has this text been used to oppress? And how has it been used to lift people up and to liberate? When have each of those things occurred? When maybe there have been mixtures of both? Throughout the years, there are various African American leaders whom we lift up as being servant leaders in a positive way, about Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela. And yet, recognizing that for some, those words are wrought with harm. And how do we make sense of all of that? Some scholars and leadership writers critique the term servant leadership as a model when servants give too much of themselves away, aside from the other historical connotations as well. And that's something to pay attention to too. When in wanting to pour oneself out in leadership, there's an imbalance between caring for others and caring for the self. And in many work environments, be they corporate, the caring professions, nurses, social workers, clergy, teachers, parents, grandparents, caregivers of many, many kinds, there's a balancing needed in a life of service. And again, following Jesus' teachings, all that considered, what does true greatness ask of us? What does that kind of leadership entail? So I come back to the beginning of the text where Jesus asked James and John, are they willing to drink from the same cup? Are they willing to be part of the same baptism that Jesus was? To me, one of the things that does mean is that we are called to pour ourselves out for the work of healing and justice in the world. When Jesus asks God in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he says, do not let this cup, if you could let this cup pass before me, but he chooses not to, we are all called to drink of that same cup of the suffering of the world. I believe that is true. And how do we balance all that with caring for ourselves and each other and the world? For that's what true vocation is. Many of you may know the great quote from the Presbyterian minister Frederick Buechner. Some of you may be hearing this for the first time, about his understanding of vocation, again, that word comes from the Latin, for all the Latin scholars out there, vocare, to call. It is where the deep gladness, your deep gladness, and the world's deep hunger, where those things meet, that's where your calling is. That's where my calling is. Again, the deep gladness, your own deep gladness, and the world's deep hunger, where those two meet, that's where our vocation is. And I think that this true greatness asks for an internal listening of the Spirit's work within all of us, that we may have open eyes, open hearts, and open minds to see the hungers of the world, to know our own hungers and our own deep gladness, and to see how those best intersect as we live out our ministries in the world. Friends, there's a rhythm that we're called to as followers of Jesus about pouring ourselves out and also filling our cups. And sometimes we say in Christianity, sometimes you're the host and sometimes you're the guest, and those things kind of ebb and flow throughout our lives. And there's a give and take, and there's a sharing, and then there's a replenishing in order that we may live our lives in the fullness which God intends. We remember Jesus himself went away to pray and to be alone with God. Jesus gave and received hospitality with the outcast, the marginalized, and those whom society called less than. So as we hear the gospel lesson this day, where might the Spirit be speaking to you in a new way in this beautiful season of fall? Is there a place where the hungers of the world and your deep gladness need some tending in your soul? And now to go back to the beginning of the text. Do you ever find yourself like James and John at the beginning, jockeying for position, feeling a need to prove yourself? For we live in a highly, highly competitive world. And while competition is not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, when too does that get out of balance and we get pulled away from our most authentic selves by feeling we need to either take up too much of the airtime, the situation, or whatever it might be, that we need to remember with some humility who it is that we really are, for that happens to every one of us at different times. So as we ponder all of that, I want to close with an example of what humility looks like, I think, considering the text and also these beautiful words of the Irish poet John O'Donoghue. And he turns to the word humility by using the root word of humus in the Latin as well, which we also have in the scriptures, earth, Adam, earth creature, all of that. The meaning of humility, humus, as we think about the soil of our lives. He writes, I've shared elsewhere how humility is having a true perspective and understanding of oneself, not some deprecating opinion. Connecting us to the soil which receives and grows many things, John O'Donoghue offers us a great description of humility. Now here it is. Now, like the silent earth, the cradle of all growth, you too can watch the stirring of a new springtime in the clay of your heart. You gain courage, you become sure about who you are, and you no longer need to either force either image or identity. When you come into rhythm with your nature, things happen of themselves. You no longer need to force image or identity. When you come into rhythm with your nature, things happen of themselves. No need to jockey for position, but to share in humble abundance what we've been given for the healing of the world. He continues, my dream is for people to awaken to who they are and what they can do, not to hesitate and step back from this or to try to be someone they're not. Lives lived in this direction become a cradle for new growth, welcoming and hospitable to others, to the life of the earth, and to their future self. In this, each person finds their genius, the standout contribution they have to make, unrepeatable. Scarcity worldviews are cynical to the suggestion everyone has a standout contribution to make. Abundance worldviews know, however, that there will be a right situation or context for everyone to bring their creative, dissonant, edgy voice. Again, not that we are better than, but that we are part and parcel of a whole called to share our giftedness in community for the healing of the world, beginning with the depths of our own hearts and lives, that we may be the body of Christ for the world. Thanks be to God. Amen.